All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. In 1992, we saw the New York Mets go all out in free agency in order to try to make a run at winning the World Series. That offseason, the Mets would sign the likes of Bobby Bonilla and Eddie Murray while acquiring pitcher Brett Saberhagen from the Kansas City Royals. And as the Mets were expected to be in contention to win the World Series, they go on to lose 90 games, which resulted in them finishing in fifth place in the then six-team National League East. Following the underwhelming season in 1992, we saw that year New York area sports writer Bob Clappish, author of the book The Worst Team That Money Can Buy, as that version of the Mets spent a then league high $45 million on payroll in attempts to win the World Series. And 31 years later, we are witnessing the sequel in Flushing. This past offseason, the Mets went crazy in spending in order to retain some of their own players from last year, as well as signing other teams' free agents. And when it was all said and done, the Mets had set a Major League Baseball record with a payroll over 345 million. And like 1992, the Mets were once again expected to be a World Series contender when the season began. But this year for the Amazons was lost from the word go. And I say that because the Edwin Diaz injury in the World Baseball Classic really put this team behind the eight ball because he was going to be their shutdown guy for the ninth inning. They then had to bump David Robertson up from the eighth inning guy to the ninth inning guy, and that thinned out their bullpen. Then from there, not only that, players that the Mets spent big money in free agency on have not delivered, regardless if it's the pitching staff or the lineup. The Mets came in today hitting 12th in the National League while they were eighth in team ERA. The numbers have been down all across this lineup. Pete Alonso, Francisco Lindor, and Jeff McNeil are just three examples of guys who are not hitting close to what they were last season. You look at this pitching staff. Justin Verlander was one of those guys that the Mets spent big money on this past offseason, and the former American League Cy Young Award winner has struggled at times this season, but recently he has shown his Cooperstown form over his last couple of starts. Now, the previous offseason, Max Scherzer was the big signing in free agency for the Mets. And, he was supposed to be the other part of that equation in this rotation along with Verlander. But this year, an ERA north of 4 has made him expendable. And of course, that resulted in him today being traded to the Texas Rangers. Now, Scherzer grew frustrated with the Mets front office after they traded reliever David Robertson earlier this week to the Miami Marlins, which all but signaled that New York would be sellers at the trade deadline, which is in just 2 days. Now, Scherzer himself has struggled, and he admitted that he has not, held up his end of the bargain. But you think about Scherzer's struggles this season, along with last year in the wild card round for the Mets in game number one, where he laid that egg on the mound versus the San Diego Padres. That's always going to be the highlight, if you will, during his time with the Mets. As that pretty much sums up his time here, and his struggles at times, pretty much sum up the current Mets. But let's take a step back here because I want to give some credit to Mets team owner Steve Cohen, who has seen enough and he's throwing in the towel on a disappointing 2023 as New York will now begin their focus on 2024. I give him credit because Cohen is willing to move on from guys regardless of their price tag, which is something that the previous regime of Fred and Jeff Wilpon would not have done. Remember, last year, Steve Cohen cut Robinson Cano a check for $37 million and said, thanks for coming. I guarantee you, if Fred Wilpon still owned the Mets, Robinson Cano would still be the Mets everyday second baseman rather. And of course, if you look at Robinson Cano's last year with the Mets, you could clearly see that he was finished. So from that standpoint, credit to Cohen for saying, you know what, let's cut bait and let's move on. At the end of the day, More often than not, regardless of the sport, spending money does not always result in titles. And Cohen, when he came in, he wanted to be the guy to lead the Mets to a World Series championship within his first 5 years owning the team. But it looks like that is not going to happen. However, Cohen also wants long term stability, and that's going to come from building within. And I'm talking about developing your minor league system. And he also mentioned earlier this year when he basically addressed the state of the team when it was clear that this team was going to be underachievers, was that, hey, listen, I'm willing to eat some of this salary if I trade some of these guys and I get back top prospects. So it's going to be interesting to see, how the Mets are going to be able to build their farm system. That's going to be something that's going to be very telling as far as the sustained success that Steve Cohen is looking for with this team. The Mets right now, they're officially open for business. They've thrown in the towel, and you got to wonder who's next. Obviously, people are going to be talking about Tommy Pham. Some people are going to mention Verlander. I'm not sure if Justin Verlander is going anywhere. I do believe, in my opinion, I do believe that Justin Verlander will be with the Mets at least at the start of next season. But I will also say this, just because the Mets have been a disappointment this year, do not think that Cohen won't go out there and spend money this winter if it means that the Mets are going to have an opportunity to improve this team next year. I don't think that he's going to be a guy that's going to shy away from that. However, I do think that, you know what, he's still going to be a guy that wants to go out there and get the star players. He has that George Steinbrenner gene, if you will. But I will also say this about the Mets: it doesn't matter who the owner is. If you study this team's history, they, number one, have never been able to have sustained success as a franchise. And number two, they have also struggled when it comes to big time spending and free agency. More often than not, for the Mets, it doesn't work out. And usually they end up spending big money on guys who are at the end of their careers. Pedro Martinez was never the pitcher that he was during his prime with the Red Sox and Expos by the time he came to the Mets. The same thing can be said for Tom Glavine after all of those stellar years with the Atlanta Braves, and I can go right down the list. Max Scherzer was another one of those guys. Max Scherzer is a future Hall of Famer, but most people are not going to remember his time with the New York Mets. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens this offseason. And it's also going to be interesting to see what the Mets do for the rest of the season. And I'm talking about the guys that take the field every day, because now, being the guys are being traded, this is going to be more of an opportunity for players, for young players, hopefully, to get more reps out there, whether it's in the rotation or whether it's in the everyday lineup. I mean, this team entered play today with a record of 49 and 54. They're more than likely going to finish with a losing record. They're not going to finish any higher than third. Third would be pushing it at this point in the National League East. Nobody's catching the Atlanta Braves. The Philadelphia Phillies are starting to play some better baseball. The Miami Marlins have overachieved. And then because of that, they actually became buyers at the trade deadline, as we just saw them acquire David Robertson from the New York Mets. So obviously the Mets are looking at the future, even with the expanded wild card. Billy Epler looks like he's going to be there for the long haul, running this front office for the Mets. Buck Showalter, I do expect him to be back next year as a Mets manager, because Steve Cohen feels that it's important to have stability in his front office and at the managerial position. But with that said, obviously with the players, Scherzer was frustrated with the trade of David Robertson. But at the end of the day, if Scherzer had pitched better this season, then maybe David Robertson doesn't get traded a couple of days ago. If this lineup had produced better than what they have so far this season, maybe, Scherzer and David Robertson and even Eduardo Escobar are still Mets at this point of the season. But I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. I do think that there are more moves coming for the Mets. And again, this has been an utter disappointment. There's no other way to say it. The Mets are 49 and 54. But once you take that 14-7 start out of the equation, you're talking about a Mets team that is just 35-47. That's not a good look. This team had to sell. And again, credit to Steve Cohen for saying simply, you know what, enough's enough. It ain't working out. Let's move on. Let's cut our losses and let's focus on next season. So for Max Scherzer, he gets an opportunity now to be with another contender in the Texas Rangers. He's helped the Mets make the playoffs. He helped the Washington Nationals win a World Series. He got to the playoffs with both the Los Angeles Dodgers and Detroit Tigers. So he knows what it takes to get it done in the to be a part of a team that makes the postseason. And even at this advanced stage of his career, I think he will, be revitalized. Even though he's been a disappointment this year, I think he will be revitalized with the Rangers. He goes to a team that's in first place in their division. He goes to a team that has eyes on making the postseason, and he goes to a team that has eyes on doing big things when the postseason rolls around. So, you know what? It was a mutual thing because obviously Max Scherzer had to waive his no trade clause in order for the Mets to ship him to Texas. He was an unhappy camper. It doesn't make sense for any organization to keep unhappy campers around. The Mets move on. Max Scherzer moves on, and let's see if the Mets can find a way to get ahead of this thing. Obviously, not for this year, but to try to find that sustained success going forward as 2023 has and will continue to be an utter failure. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it will be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin, and I am signing off. And I'm saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.